Le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam știam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut.
Răsună grâmbiți Hello, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 18th of September 2024, and you join us today for a live stream update on the latest coming out of the war between the Russian Federation and the forces arrayed against them by US imperialism in the territory of the country known as Ukraine. Now, first, a word upon who are our patriots today. I'm, of course, paraphrasing the late great Luke Kelly in his, more of a poem than anything else. It's is entitled "For What Died the Sons of Roshin," and in it he's talking about the what Irish patriotism means, and he says in that, "For what died the sons of Roshin? Was it greed?" And it is upon that topic that I will open up, which is, of course, for what are the sons of Ukraine dying? Is it greed? And in the case of those who are sent to fight and die on the front lines against Russia, then it is most certainly greed. It is most certainly the greed, squalor, short-sightedness, and treachery of the Ukrainian capitalist class. And it is them, over the course of the past 30 years, who have sold the Ukrainian nation into bondage of the Wall Street banks, of the City of London, of the Paris Bourse, of the imperialists from Germany and the Netherlands and elsewhere. It is they who, following the counter-revolution of 1991, or I should say more accurately 1989 to 1991, that sold Ukraine to the West. And this is what the sons and some daughters of Ukraine are dying for now in vast numbers, often in unmarked graves in the east of the country that was called Ukraine. It is for the greed, it is for the self-interest, it is for the rapaciousness and squalor of the Ukrainian capitalist class. A capitalist class more disgusting, it is only possible to find, of course, in the countries of their masters, in Britain, in the United States, and elsewhere. This is the truth that, of course, nobody in the bourgeois press will tell you. They tell you how much they are, of course, as did the recent wannabe assassin of Donald Trump tell you, how much they support Ukraine. Well, they're not supporting the Ukrainian worker. They're supporting, well, their own ambitions, the ambitions of the U.S. imperialists. At best, one could say they are supporting the limitless greed and self-interest of the Ukrainian capitalist class. So, where are the Ukrainian patriots? Well, none of them exist inside the ranks of the Maidan movement. The Maidan movement, such as it was, and the Orange Revolution a decade before, can't be classified in any way as Ukrainian patriots, because what was the mission of these people? These were foreign-funded entities who were employed to use violence to deliver Ukraine into the sole ownership of US imperialism and its allies. So there's nothing remotely patriotic about any of that. That's why they have to dress it all up in bullshit and fantasies. The real Ukrainian patriots, of course, are a mixture of people. They are those who rebelled immediately against the Maidan regime, those who were burnt and died horribly in the Odessa Hall of Trade Unions. And perhaps the most real Ukrainian patriots today are those who are resisting the Zelensky regime, or I should put it more accurately, the US imperialist installed regime of Kiev. Those who are resisting behind the front lines, sabotaging the NATO war plans in both Ukraine itself and in countries surrounding Ukraine. There is a very active and very real Ukrainian resistance movement that is underground, that is coordinated amongst mostly the Ukrainian workers. The Ukrainian bourgeois want nothing to do with it, of course. They are all on the other side. The Ukrainian upper petty bourgeoisie have either fled or are trying to buy their way out of the country. It is the Ukrainian worker who remains the bedrock of resistance against fascism and against the domination of the country by US imperialism. And it is to that Ukrainian worker or those Ukrainian workers who we must all raise our hands in a red salute to. Some of them may be communists, some of them may not be, but certainly they are the people fighting in a very, very risky, very dangerous war, which if you've ever read about any of the history of resistance movements against fascism, it often ends in tragedy and disaster. But ultimately, these people come out vindicated and victorious. So we will start with that and move on to the actual updates here. So we discussed yesterday when we were nominally talking about West Asia, but the subject came up, the question of the missile strikes inside the pre-2022 borders of the Russian Federation, and how I say Keir Starmer, but he's just a sort of avatar, really, just a sort of a puppet of the real forces in charge of the British government, which are, as I will keep repeating, the interests of the City of London, the interests of the major capitalists in Britain, the interests of the senior military men and the militarist bureaucracy that runs large elements of the British state. That's who Keir Starmer represents, and it is through him that this militarist clique is making its demands known to the U.S. imperialists, that they want the ability, or they want to be able to have Storm Shadow or Scalp missiles launched inside the borders of inside the borders of the Russian Federation, and to be protected from the consequences. That's what Keir Starmer went to negotiate with Joe Biden about, and it's why Joe Biden told him no. And so now Keir Starmer's waffling and wavering back and forth all over the place, because they know very well that if the Russians wanted to, if they really wanted to, they could severely cripple the British military in various places around the world. It wouldn't even have to be in Ukraine, wouldn't even have to be in Britain. There's plenty of places where the British are exposed, and they know that. And the Russians could get them in many different places. They could even, as one commentator on Twitter pointed out, they could even conceivably sink the useless lumps of metal known as the British aircraft carrier fleet, which are barely functional, and which would, of course, create an enormous, embarrassing scandal for the British government. It would reveal the complete military impotence of Britain. And they know all this, which is why they're begging Biden to protect them. And it's, of course, the reason why Biden won't, or the US imperialists, I should say, won't. Forget Biden. Because they know very well that the thing that they can't have over everything else, as even Radek Sikorski, the ultra-reactionary Polish foreign minister, pointed out when he got pranked by the Russian prankster duo Vovin and Lexus recently. He said that the direct war with Russia is the red line. It's off the table. Because, like a good servant of American imperialism, he is conveying the message from his masters, which is that American imperialism cannot risk a direct war with Russia, a war that they could not possibly win. And so they're prepared to allow their puppets to take risks, but they're not prepared to take risks for them. So the answer would have been given to Keir Starmer, oh yeah, Keir, if you want to do that, go ahead. And Keir would have said, in his own inimitable way, oh, Mr. President, do I have your full backing? And Joe Biden would have gone, hey man, look, listen here, Harold Callahan, you got my backing to go fire your missile, and then you can get on with it. And then Keir Starmer would have stammered out a demand for US protection in the case of Russian reprisals, and Biden would have waffled around it and not said anything. And that's why it's not happening. That's why it won't happen. Because the US will not put themselves in the position of being in a direct shooting war with the Russians. They'll do an awful lot of stuff to the Russians, but we should bear in mind that there has always been communication directly between the Russian and the American intelligence services and the Russian and the American military. In fact, it is near constant, as Putin said when he was interviewed by CIA asset Tucker Carlson. The special services talk to each other constantly. So this idea that there's no talks at all is simply untrue. There are talks constantly about how far each side is going. Situation is being managed to a degree. Of course, all these things can always escalate out of control. The problem the British have got is that they know in the end, or some of them do, the more intelligent of them do, that ultimately the US will bargain with the Russians in the end. It'll take a while yet, but there will be a bargain done. It will be a bargain that essentially cuts the knees out from under cuts the knees out from the US's own allies. This is what they've done before. It's what they will do again. When the US, if there is a new US administration, or even if it's a continuity Harris administration, eventually Ukraine will slowly get cut off. And eventually the Russians will achieve their objectives. And eventually there will be some kind of backroom deal. The British are concerned because it's a backroom deal that they're worried that they won't get a say on, which they won't in the end. When the US decides that enough is enough and they haven't achieved their objectives and it's time to go elsewhere, or that there's more pressing matters elsewhere, as this brewing storm in West Asia it might constitute such a matter. If the US decides, well, we better turn our focus elsewhere, then the British will be left pissing in the wind. They'll be posturing and gesticulating wildly at the Russian armed forces, but the Russian armed forces have absolutely nothing to fear from any of the European armies. Again, without the US imperialists, there is no NATO. There is no military force in Europe that could possibly hope to take on the Russians if you subtract the American imperialists from that. They all know this. This is the reason why Starmer was over there begging Biden. And the reason why Starmer got nowhere is because there is a shifting change in priorities inside the US administration and inside the wider US ruling class circles. The consensus is slowly moving towards the idea that this operation in Ukraine hasn't worked, that it is largely the fault of Biden and his crew, and that things have gone very wrong elsewhere. Trump is expressing this over and over again in his statements. His reason why, part of the reason why anyway, other than Trump's own natural tendency towards hyperbole, why he's saying, if you don't vote for me, there's no more Israel. It's going to be gone, folks. Kamala's going to kill it. Which, if only that were true. But he's expressing a point of view that he's picked up from ruling class circles in the United States, that the Biden administration's obsession with regime change in Russia has basically compromised the US position elsewhere in the world. That in itself is an incorrect point of view, because the US position has been being slowly compromised by the developments in West Asia for many, many years now. But to go back to the point about the missile question, related to this is the F-16 question. Now, the F-16s have already made appearances, and apparently at least 2 of them have been shot down by Russian air defense. So now a story came out that from Resident, one of the big Ukrainian leak channels, that the Americans are putting limitations on how far the F-16s can fly near to Russian territory, for fear that they're all going to get shot down within a few days. So basically their job is to appear in the skies, possibly offer air support to Ukrainian forces within range, but not to fly the kind of long-range missions that actually launching these Storm Shadow missiles or other air-launched missiles into Russia would necessitate, because there isn't that many F-16s, and if they all get shot down within a week, that's not particularly impressive. Better from the Americans' point of view to have these things flying around, presenting a lot of impressive imagery in to the press, whilst not actually doing very much. Better that than having them all turned into scrap metal by Russian air defense. So this is the reason why old Sir Keir is looking distinctly high and dry at the moment. And again, like, I would urge you all to not take too seriously the idea that Keir Starmer is an actual individual. Keir Starmer, as I said, is an avatar for the interests of the most rabid and reactionary sections of the British ruling class, which is quite a lot of them. But one of the schemes within schemes that the British ruling class are running at the moment is the idea that if they reunify with Europe, that they can basically strong-arm the French and the Germans and the Italians and the Spanish and anyone else who can be strong-armed into continuing the Ukraine war by providing unlimited financing to the Kiev regime. That's one of the things that the British clearly want to do. This was an idea that got floated around by some ultra-reactionaries, i.e. most of the members of parliament in this country, back in the period of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. Because remember, when the US decided to pull the rug on that one, they did so with minimal consultation with the British. They told the British that they were going, and the British had to skedaddle out of there as well. And it was a big, big humiliation for the British, worse for the British than for the Americans even. The Americans still have a lot of power. The British don't. So they got humiliated by that. And they fear that the US imperialists are going to do the same to them again in Ukraine, which is why Sir Keir is running around trying to ingratiate himself with various European leaders, because what they want is for the European Union, and to get this they need the big countries of the EU on board, to essentially declare a blank check for the Kiev regime and to make up any shortfall coming from the United States. Now, it's my view that they can't do this, nor will they want to do this. I mean, Macron's already sinking. The Ukraine war is part of the reason why he is. Scholz is sinking too. Incidentally, the farce of the so-called immigration policy was revealed by Olaf Scholz in the last week, doing a load of posturing over the German border and temporarily stepping out of the Schengen agreement, babbling away about concerns over immigration, whilst then going over to Kenya and saying, hey, President Ruto, can you provide us with a bunch of wage slaves so we can hyper-exploit? And of course, Ruto is delighted to get rid of proletarians out of Kenya into Germany, because it might defuse the revolutionary movement that's confronting him at the moment. The high farce of so-called immigration debate revealed in the form of the farce that is Olaf Scholz. But that's a digression. So Sir Keir's devious plan, if he can't get the US over it, more invested in the perpetual support for the Kiev regime, their latest plan is to try and get the Europeans to do it. And of course, this is the Europeans are well aware that the Brits are only looking after their own interests. That they have a very big interest in collapsing Russia, and so they're desperately trying to convince everybody else to come on board with them to perpetuate the war. I don't think they're going to succeed. As I said, Macron and Scholz are busted flushes, and Scholz is desperate to try and defuse the political crisis facing him in Germany. Meloni heads an administration which is weak, has already capitulated to NATO on every single conceivable issue, but which is becoming increasingly unpopular and is, of course, divided. So these aren't strong political players who can risk fronting up a war with the Russians. The British ruling class, of course, won't want to fight a war with the Russians themselves. They'll want anybody but themselves to do it. The British policy can only succeed if the British population is never really made aware of just how far the government is going. So they want to, ideally, continue the war, expending the lives of Ukrainians. But for the British, I think, if they can't get the Ukrainians to expend themselves anymore, or the Ukraine is incapable of fighting, well, maybe the Poles will go. And for the British ruling class, a large section of the American ruling class as well, it really is that cynical. Just convince one country after another to march into Ukraine and die horrifically. But I think that the British ruling class are running out of ways to cover up that the emperor has no clothes. Sooner rather than later, this trick is going to be revealed for what it is. And the British ruling class are going to be revealed for what they are, which is a naked emperor, truly a naked emperor. The prospects for the future of British imperialism are bleak, and the prospects for the continuation of this form of the British state are bleak. The reason why I say that is because it's a realistic assessment. This government headed by Starmer is becoming despised incredibly quickly. There's no honeymoon period. His strategies of managing the population are so far coming up short. And so therefore the only thing he's got left is a desperate roll of the dice to try and perpetuate, to continue the Ukraine war in the hope that something will cause Russia to collapse. Of course, none of this is going to work. So that sort of tangential story from the missile question. The other points regarding Ukraine is that again, according to Ukrainian sources, the Ukrainians around Pokrovsk are surrendering and deserting in huge numbers now. The reasons for this, of course, are firstly, they are losing the war and are having casualties inflicted upon them that are horrific. But also, again, according to Ukrainian sources, quoted on the Legitimny and the Resident Telegram channel, they are suffering from a collapse in morale of the Ukrainian armed forces that comes partially from the fact that the latest wave of mobilization are these recruits are literally men who have been press ganged off the street and have very little training and have no motivation to be there. And this is causing a collapse in morale of Ukrainian units. That's why you're having more and more high numbers of surrender, those surrendering to the Russians, desertions, mass fleeing of the battlefield. This is a disaster unfolding around Pokrovsk, which again, like it is acknowledged in some of the more serious bourgeois journals, but it's not acknowledged in many other places. The fact is that the level of fighting ability of the Ukrainian army is collapsing slowly, bit by bit, and this is the way in which it will slowly come to an end. The Kursk incursion turned out to be exactly the disaster that many of us thought that it would be. A temporary setback for the Russians, but nothing that they couldn't wrap up within a few weeks. So the disaster around Pokrovsk is the inevitable outcome of the deterioration of the Ukrainian armed forces. The fact that the speeded up training courses they're trying to send their dragooned men, their whipped soldiers on, aren't equipping them in the slightest to deal with the horrific reality of the battlefield in the east, and that's why you're getting desertions and surrenders as a result, and unauthorized retreats as well. Even an internal Ukrainian report that was leaked recently showed that even high Ukrainian government officials are saying that the training provided by the NATO instructors is now completely inadequate for the task in hand. I think it's probably been inadequate from the start, to be honest. So disasters continue in and around the front line. The other story that came out recently related to the press gangs in Ukraine was that the TCC, as they are known, this is the Ukrainian press gang operation. This now consists of around about 90,000 men at least. So the press gang operation in Ukraine has 90,000 men, all of whom have specific targets they are working towards to bring people in. And they have resorted to beatings, kidnappings, abductions of people who are supposedly below the age of like 24 or 25, which I think is the conscription age. So they are breaking even their own rules. 50,000 of them, apparently, of these 90,000 press gang men, have never been to the front line. So one can only imagine the level of bribes that have to be paid in order to keep yourself off the front line in Ukraine. But 50,000 of them apparently have managed to keep themselves off the front line. And the fact that so many of their vehicles are being attacked, that they themselves are being physically attacked in the streets, but it only shows just how despised the war is becoming and how those openly abducting people to serve in it have become. Though, as I've said before, I'm reliably informed that the press gang operation is actually run by a private company that was established all the way back in the late 2000s, I think in 2007, as one correspondent informed me, which means that they were preparing for this, advised by the US imperialists, advised there in heavy inverted commas, since at least 2007, which is perhaps why the dragooning operation is so large. But 90,000 men, I mean, that's almost the same size as the British Army itself. So where on earth is it that they're going to find more soldiers? The answer is they're going to continue abducting people. And they're going to continue abducting people and kidnapping people, if you prefer, off the streets, until, of course, the level of resistance builds to the point where they can no longer do it. And one can only hope that that point will come soon. So another point to raise here, to go back to the interesting thing about Ukrainian resistance within Ukraine. Of course, we've covered before the Ukrainian resistors burning the cars of the press gangs, but also there's reliable reports coming in of the various acts of Ukrainian resistance as far afield as Poland and the Baltic states now, and Moldova, where Ukrainian partisans are sabotaging NATO war planning efforts or NATO supply chains. So this is the reality of the struggle here, and one that is never reported on in the West, is that Ukrainian resistance to the fascist regime, the Comprador regime, has never stopped. And this is why when I hear some bozos babbling on about, Ukrainians deserve it, they got what they were looking for. Well, no. There's always been a significant amount of Ukrainian resistance to the Comprador regime in Kiev. It has never been representative of all Ukrainians, just as, by the way, no bourgeois government is representative of its working class, not really. And so to all those who try to condemn all Ukrainians because of the criminality of the Ukrainian ruling class, I would say that those who purports to be Marxist within this group should really know better. And those who call themselves, I don't know what the latest branding is, multipolar theorists or something, should really get themselves an education as to what bourgeois democracy actually is and how much of a con bourgeois rule is. No bourgeois government represents its proletariat, none of them. Same is true in Ukraine, the same is true in France, same is true in Britain. So, want to get in more questions tonight, so I'm going to go back to the start of this chat and take in as many people as I can. Hope you all are enjoying the return of the music, by the way. I am working on a new musical introduction, but we're bringing back the classic one for now. So, greetings to Otis, who joins us, and Edward, who says, is socialism or communism possible in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states in general? Interesting comment or question. I mean, Gulf states, if you look at the composition of the working class in the Gulf states, it's all people from other places. It's people from Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, I think also the Philippines. Then, so for those places, there isn't much of a domestic working class. So, I mean, if Qatar, UAE, etc., wouldn't really exist under socialism. I mean, I think for Saudi Arabia, it is fundamentally, I think, a bit of a false creation. I mean, what you'd much more be likely to have would be socialism that comes through some kind of Arabian federation, including Yemen, including Oman, including possibly Iraq. I'm not sure of the exact geographies there, but I think it would be an Arabian Socialist Federation would be the more likely outcome. Given the perverse state of class relations inside Saudi Arabia as well, in that they rely on a hell of a lot of imported workers rather than having a domestic proletariat. But again, class relations in Saudi Arabia is an interesting question. I need to look more into it before I give you a definitive answer on that point. There was a Saudi Arabian Communist Party, though, at one point in the middle 1970s, I think, there was one there. Not very big, and it got wiped out pretty quickly. But again, more research needed from me on the Saudi Arabian class question. Greetings to Grassy Knoll over there in Seattle, Washington, and greetings to Svetlana, who joins us from Moscow. Svetlana says, in a bid to economize, residents of Nikolaev were ordered this Monday not to use fridges or lifts. Bad news for pensioners in a 16-story building. Yes, indeed. And this is, of course, down to the fact that the power grid in Ukraine has been slowly collapsing for many months now. Svetlana adds, and this same Monday, the city budget, that is in Nikolaev, allocated 1.7 million hryvnia to build a private road leading to 3 elite villas owned by 2 businessmen and the chief of the region's state emergency service. Well, there you go. That's the nature of who rules Ukraine. Millions of working-class Ukrainians marched off to die horribly, so these scumbags can have a private villa each. I mean, the Ukrainian ruling class deserve absolutely no mercy from the Ukrainian working class. Like, these people are the scum of the earth who have sold the nation to even worse scum, which is, of course, the American and British ruling class. Luca, good evening to you, who is, of course, joining us from perfidious Albion. Krasovets is with us, as is HM in Brighton, as is More Time Needed over there in Skegi on the East Coast Riviera. Anthony McKeown joins us from Prague. Nehat Mere joins us from Istanbul. And you are glad, Nehat, that the music is back. Good for it to be back. John Barleycorn joins us. There were 3 men came out of the West, their fortunes for to try. I won't complete the rest of that line because it sounds threatening. Krasovets, hello to you, says you are experiencing syncing issues on the phone and TV casting. Yeah, you often find that like internet radio and digital radio, in some cases, don't sync up very well. I'm not sure what's going on with your stuff there, but I found that myself. And we also have Batman joining us, as is Dimitri is here, as is Lee, as is Tim Gray. Good evening to Davey, who joins us, and Peter, also from Perfidious Albion. Tom Jode is with us. Loam Bart says, Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, probably the most attacked and defamed men in history. Yes, they are, and there's a reason for that. The reason for that is the ruling class still fears their analysis and their achievements and what they stood for and the lessons they have to teach us. So being defamed by the ruling class is no bad thing. It just needs communists to be strong in their advocacy for the path to liberation that these men showed us. T.G. Wilson, good evening to you. Kevin, good evening to you. Lars joins us from Sweden. Krasovets is enjoying the red moon through the window tonight. Well, I'll have to stick my head out the window soon and see what's out there. Salutations to Comrade Jawad, who joins us. Tom Joad says, a true patriot holds his government to account. True, and a true patriot wouldn't sell his country to the U.S. imperialists. Hello to John Rudd. I can't read the heavily Gothic script there. Alex Oliveira, hello to you. You were enjoying the Biden impression there? Good to hear. Movie Maker Joe, long-term viewer, says, just on Europe, wide rejection. Are any communists involved in the poster advertisement explosion promoting Russian and Italian friendship in Rome and across Italy? Don't know. Be interested to find out. Abtin says, if the West wants victory in Ukraine, all they need is a chain of Arby's in Russia. Well, they sanctioned themselves out of the Russian food business, and thankfully, it would seem that despite Mikhail Gorbachev's best efforts, Western fast food was not as popular as he would have hoped in Russia. Good evening to Irish Partisan, who says, I hear Sir Keith is on a grand tour of France, Germany and Italy to beg them to join his crusade against Russia. Well, Sir Keir should march off to Russia himself. He should saddle up, go in like Lord Cardigan in the 1850s, charging on a donkey into the mouths of the Russian guns. I'm sure we'd all salute his heroism and mourn his loss. Movie Maker Joe says, the British strong-arming, what a weak pathetic has-been. Strong-arming. Well, you can still strong-arm somebody if you hold all their money, you know. The British have other ways of getting their way, even if they've lost the military edge. They still can move a lot of capital around, and they can make a lot of threats that way. And promises, too. Promises to, of course, go back into the EU. Whether the French and the Germans would want them, of course, another matter. But to go in and strengthen the EU at a time when the EU is acknowledged even by Mario Draghi as falling to pieces, that might be a tempting offer. Though beware of Brits bearing gifts, I will always say. Natalia Volkova says, European countries despise Great Britain. Everybody despises it. Well, the British ruling class deserve that. You deserve all of your hatred, as they deserve ours too. Svetlana says, I lived in London for 3 years. I was horrified to hear that British pensioners are... Oh, we've lost control of the chat there. Just scrolling back up again. British pensioners are treated so badly. I don't wish to gloat, but pensioners have always been treated well in Russia, except in the 90s, of course. Well, this is the brutality of the British ruling class in action. They don't even treat their own citizens with respect at all, no matter what kind of life those citizens have led. Peter says, Sir Keir is serving the most extermination-prone faction of the British bourgeoisie. When they see every contradiction as a mere opposition that can be eradicated, exterminating the opponent. Fortunately for us, they've cut their own knees off by destroying their own military and industrial capacities. So this really is an impotent rage moment. Michael, Stalin joins us tomorrow, so come back for that. Be sure to do so. Batman says it's pretty crazy seeing this government be hated as much as a government that's been in for 4 years and they haven't been in for 4 months. Again, it's all explained in the election result. They are not a popular party. They won because the Conservatives collapsed, not because anybody believes in them. And again, that's been demonstrated very strongly by Sir Keir so far. And by the way, that Sir Keir Starmer is such a blatantly corrupt man as well really doesn't help him. I mean, he can't keep his hands out of the till, can't keep his hands off corporate freebies and petty little bribes. I mean, what kind of man spends £2,000 on a pair of glasses? You know? What kind of person does that? The answer is somebody who is desperate to lead the life of a bourgeois. That's why men like that are very easy to manipulate. T.G. Wilson says, Marx wrote the bulk of Capital Volume 1 from the British Library in London. Indeed, he did. Tim Gray says, I suspect the situation in West Asia is far more serious for the US. However, what is clear is that the US cannot mount a large-scale land invasion anywhere, which is very true. We were discussing that last night. And I think Tim's point is correct, which is that they can't... The situation in West Asia is more important for them. If they lose that, they lose everything. But can they mobilize in support of Israel in a sustained fashion? My suspicion is no. Okay. B. Illich says Vugladar and Chasov Yar are also in bad shape. Indeed, they are. Batman says British Museum is not far from where Marx lived and where Lenin lived. Indeed, I've seen the Marx Memorial Library recently, earlier this year. Very interesting, worth a visit. And Svetlana says in some cities in the south of Ukraine, teenagers have begun to go missing these past 2 weeks. One doesn't have to be Sherlock Holmes to guess where they've been taken. Yeah, abductions en masse. Krasovet says, I've heard that it's roughly 7,000-ish Ukrainian POWs in Russian custody. Is that in total or just from the results of the last few weeks, i.e. the Kursk incursion, etc.? Peter says, what gets individualized as sociopathy or psychopathy in bourgeois psychiatry and psychology is actively inculcated by predatory imperialist logics. And it's reinforced by the schooling that the bourgeois give their offspring. I mean, if you go to like one of the top end private schools in Britain, sociopathic behavior is positively encouraged and in fact drummed into you. Because that's part of how they perpetuate their rule, by making sure the next generation's as propagandized and insane as possible. Grassy Knoll says, how effective are troops that have been abducted? Well, I think the answer lies in the fact that so many of them are surrendering, because if they've had to be literally torn off the streets, stuffed in a uniform and thrown out of a van onto the front line, they're not going to be any good at fighting the Russians, are they? They're just literally a meat shield, bullet stoppers. And so therefore they're going to quit as soon as they possibly can, and they're right to do so. Tom Joad says NATO special forces have been killed too. British and French soldiers were taken out apparently. Yeah, I've heard quite a bit about that. I need to research into it to see if the MOD has admitted to any deaths. I don't think they will have done. I think any British soldier that's been sent there has probably been told that they will get big money if they, formally speaking, resign from the British military to give the British plausible deniability and go there under contract as a mercenary, under contract with either a private company or the Ukrainian government. So any Brit that dies there will probably be classified as a mercenary. But I bet that quite a lot of them will have either have quit the military specifically to go there, or will have recently quit the military and been offered big money to go there. Either way, whatever money they were offered wouldn't have been worth it. T.G. Wilson says, every single Ukrainian refugee I've met despises Zelensky. Well, hardly a surprise, but yes. Lucas says, can I ask if you could clarify what you mean by multipolar theories? I mean that those who acknowledge that a multipolar world is coming or is already here, but whose analysis of the reasons for it revolve around what I would call a very shallow understanding of the situation. By that I mean those who don't analyze things in terms of class, those who don't analyze things in terms of the primary contradiction being imperialism. Like, there's a lot of people who object to US domination as they would see it, but they don't explain it in real ways. They hide behind terms such as globalism, and they put like a lot of belief in anybody who denounces Western values. Like, it's why you find people like shilling for Erdogan or Orban or anybody who basically offends the sensibilities of the Western leaders. You'll find people making excuses for them or saying that that Erdogan is going to join a multipolar world, and that this is the way in which justice will be found by the re-emergence of a new wave of sovereign state to sovereign state relations. It's all basically post-World War II nostalgia stuff. That's what I mean. It's those who don't, it's sort of non-Marxist analysts who can see that there is a multipolar world emerging, but due to their often very wild anti-communism, place faith in a lot of reactionary forces. Same kind of people who got excited by the idea of Javier Milei being an anti-globalist, despite the fact that he quite literally was trained by the World Economic Forum and works directly for the US State Department. And he's embedded in the old political networks of the traditional reactionary parties in Argentina. So shallow fools like that, basically. Owen Sanders says, or asks, when you say the US will cut a deal with Russia and the UK will not have its interests considered, what is the outcome the UK fears from this? Well, Britain and the British ruling class are in deep trouble because of the long-running economic crisis. To get out of that will require the opening up of new territories that can be hyper-exploited, that aren't available to British corporations now. That means Russia, that means China. Russia is regarded, wrongly as it turned out, as the more easy of the two. And if the US abandons the idea of a regime change operation in Russia for now, they won't abandon it entirely, but if they take a step back, that means that this operation is over, which means that the British aren't going to get their share, their cut of the loot, because Russia's not collapsing, Russia's winning the war. Whereas the US can soak that up. They can absorb that crisis for a while because they have other things, other areas of the world where they're more dominant. So West Asia is more important to them. Really, clinging on to that is more important in reality than going after the Russians. They'd like to cause the Russian regime to fall. They'd like to cause the Russian government to collapse. If they can't do it, though, if the choice is between going to war with the Russians, which they can't win, or upping their engagement in West Asia, they'll up their engagement in West Asia. They'll up the troop numbers there. They'll try and secure Israel. They'll try and secure their position there. That won't work either, of course, in the end. But what the British fear is a US retreat to focus on its core interests. So either West Asia or Southeast Asia. And if the US retreats from its commitments to Europe, and this has always been a British fear, dating back over many years now, then because the British strategy since at least 1956-57, since the Suez Crisis and the failure of the British ability to act independently there, since that they have relied upon the US military muscle to act for them when they needed it, and that only by riding alongside the US can the British be taken seriously. The US basically cuts them off at the knees. The ones who will be revealed to be impotent more than the US are the British, principally the British, followed by the Germans and the French. And that's what they're afraid of. They're afraid that this is the last roll of the dice, that if this doesn't work and that the US walks away, that everybody will see that the British imperialism is a naked emperor. That's what they're afraid of. Davey said, the sheer ridiculousness of British politicians supporting the Ukraine and Israel positions totally amazes me. How can our people believe the shite these fools spout? Britain is dumbed down totally. Well, the answer to your question's in your last line, Davey. Look, the reason why they get away with a lot of this is, the Israel thing is there's much more dissent around that than there is over Ukraine. But the reason why they get away with the Ukraine thing is because most people just don't see the consequences. Well, they do in a way. They see the higher energy bills. They see the food prices going up, which is partially related to the sanctions on Russia and the crisis that caused. But they're not taught to put to put two and two together. I mean, Israel's more of a scandal, but still the British government persists. For all the same reasons I talked about before with Ukraine. Same applies in West Asia. So Britain is dumbed down, and they deliberately seek to keep us as stupid and as incurious as possible. Because if you became curious about the state of the world, you might realise how badly you're getting scammed. And, well, the British ruling class don't want that. So, yeah, it's hiding things from people. It's keeping people divided and in ignorance about the world. And it's a poor level of organisation on behalf of the working class itself. Working class itself is very poorly organised or disorganised. And so, therefore, it can't mobilise even in its own interests, never mind regarding the actions of the British government in overseas countries. That's my sort of quick summary of why things are the way they are. Hard to get your head around how evil the ruling class truly are. Well, when you're this is from Tom Jode, when you are 0.5% of the population, you need to spend an awful lot of time and violence on making sure that you stay at the top. And that includes relentless lying to people, propagandizing people, dividing people, and the application of extreme violence to stay at the top. That's what the British and American, French and German ruling class do. Nehat asks, what is the ratio of foreign mercenaries in Ukrainian army to local soldiers? Who really fights for Ukraine, for NATO on the field? Interesting question. I saw numbers related to the number of Poles. I read it was at least 10,000, possibly more. There are projects trying to track the number of foreigners in Ukraine, but I'm not sure as to the ratios. Further research needed on that one. Hello to Svetlana Simonoska from Prague. Good to have you with us. Talking about music, asks Dimitri, your music is cool, but I love jazz, and the comrades from Midwest and Mark stated that jazz is reactionary music. Did they? What is your opinion on jazz? I think jazz is often technically brilliant. There's a lot of very impressive jazz artists out there, historically speaking at least, and a lot of very impressive American music is expressed that's come through the medium of the jazz form. I don't know what the comment from Midwestern Marx is, but jazz comes from came from the oppressed layers of the American population, as did blues. So I don't see those as reactionary. I mean, yes, these pieces of music, particularly like if we're talking like post 1950s stuff, where this stuff got commodified and turned into a cultural manipulation program, yeah, then like so-called rock and roll, pop music, as it is laughably entitled, most of hip hop, etc., is like a commercial and reactionary manipulation. Like jazz and blues, though, genuinely are the product of the most oppressed layers of the U.S. society. I mean, what else? Are you going to say that what Paul Robeson's music is reactionary next? I mean, I don't. That doesn't make any sense. Seems to me that that's like a misinterpretation of or a misapplication of theories from the 1940s. There, if that is indeed something that is a direct quote. As I'm not aware of the exact comment, I can't comment fully. But that's my view is that like jazz and blues, as they come from an oppressed section of the American population, are actually quite revolutionary in their implications. Yes, the commercial, dumbed down and manipulated versions of them that come out later are all crap, but that doesn't mean that the origins of them are, and that there aren't genius works there. G.G. Wilson says, Starmer waddling into Russia on the back of a donkey, mouthing sanctimonious pomposities. If he did that, it'd be the most popular thing he's ever done. David King asks, will the EU crash as the German engine has no energy? The EU will fall apart when Germany goes into a deep crisis and the German ruling class basically call time on it. I don't think we're quite there yet, though. Tom Jones says, with reference to Starmer, a large donor is buying his wife's underwear. I mean, you gotta question like what kind of man this is. I mean, Starmer's not a poor man. He was head of the prosecutorial body in this country for many years. He's been an MP for years, and they're on at least £80,000 a year. You can afford to buy your wife, and his wife's also like a very highly paid manager in the National Health Service. So you can afford to buy your own underwear. You can afford to buy your own glasses. So, I mean, Starmer's just a cheap little man who loves money. This is the thing. This is why he's so easy to manipulate. Steve Fred Johnson asks, is there a basis for a revolt within Ukraine against the recruitment regime? I think there already is one. I mean, just the sheer number of attacks on the press gangs' vehicles, there's growing resistance in Ukraine against the government, against the NATO forces. So yes, there is a resistance there. It's just that we're never told about it in the West because the Western media certainly doesn't want to talk about that. Jawad says, there is hardly any domestic working class in the UAE, Saudi and Qatar. All are brought in from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Southeast Asia, exploited to an extreme where Nazis would be proud. Yeah, I've heard about that. And they'd bring in specialists on big money from the West as well. So like for like UAE, Saudi, Qatar, I think that they'll probably disappear in the coming revolution. And a much larger Arabian federation or joint Arabian nation will emerge as a result. Judith asks, why hasn't Hezbollah got their electronic equipment from Iran, Russia or China? Is a good question, and it's a question I do not know the answer to. I mean, it's not a surprise that the Israelis found a weakness, given that the US and the Israeli intelligence services would have been working round the clock on this. But I hear that the Hezbollah have switched back to telephone, hardline telephone and motorcycle courier, which means that they will have a fallback system. Clearly, there was a weakness in, as I said, their supply operation. I mean, I hear that the Iranians concluded many years ago that they couldn't rely on anybody outside of the country for their own electronic communications equipment with regard to military issues. So they've developed their own in-house capacity. which is the only way to do it. Like, you can't rely, unless you're getting it from a rock solid ally, like you've got a complicated supply chain. There's all kinds of opportunities for the US or Israel or one of the imperialist powers to interfere and do an act of sabotage like this. T.G. Wilson says, and if one understands the nature of jazz and one has read Engels on dialectics, would understand that jazz is deeply dialectical in form and the interrelationship between the performing musicians. Agreed. Well, music is dialectical. Good music is dialectical. Bad music really isn't. Why do I think of Ben Norton? Never met him. Krasavets. I think politically, the man's basically a social democrat. Occasionally, he has interesting things on his channel. But I think he's deeply, deeply flawed, politically speaking. Tim Gray says the visual digital signal is much larger than the audio one, which is why you get sequencing issues. Interesting. Wasn't aware of that. Tom Job makes the correct point and says jazz and blues arose from slavery and the black working class. How can that be reactionary? It is the right point to make. Exactly what I was saying earlier. Luca says possibly more relevant for the post-World War II episode. What was the role of Cambodia and Pol Pot in the wars of Southeast Asia? Absolutely no idea. Well, I could talk about that a little bit, but I mean, Cambodia in the Khmer Rouge period was being used by U.S. imperialism for quite some time. The civil war in Cambodia got particularly more vicious due to the fact that U.S. imperialism was relentlessly bombing the country for years. In terms of Pol Pot, I mean, the Khmer Rouge are an odd bunch, to say the least. I would say that they represented an extreme perversion of what was once called Maoism, and they were also, and this has been spoken about by the likes of John Pilger, they were also, because they were against the Vietnamese or the Vietnamese government, they were supplied for a while by US and British imperialism because they were anti-Vietnam. So there's a hell of a lot going on there with Cambodia that I can't summarize in a few minutes, but I'll probably get to that when we get to the collapse of the French Empire, because it's relevant with regard to that. Dimitri says, most of my former colleagues, jazz musicians, especially in Russia, are reactionary liberals. Most of them left Russian Federation after 2022, but that has nothing to do with jazz, historically wrong. Yeah, I mean, the Russian musicians who sold themselves to the West are one thing. But again, as Dimitri says, that's nothing to do with jazz as a medium. It's everything to do with what happened to certain cultural layers in the late Soviet Union and in the post-Soviet Russia. How many of them just became completely absorbed into Western networks? That's a different question as to then the question of what do we think of jazz as an art form? T.G. Wilson says, jazz drumming started by slaves playing their own body. The rhythms came from Santeria and West Africa through New Orleans, second-line funeral dirges, etc. Yeah, it's music of the oppressed. Gonzalo Cabrera, hello to you. Bart Vischer says, I don't know why anyone would join the army knowing that we are actually the bad guys in the world. Many people now aren't, you know. This is the reason why they're struggling with military recruitment in the imperialist countries. People don't want to join. People don't want to fight for this anymore. T.G. Wilson says the only reactionary element will be the military formalism of Swiss drum rudiments. But by the 1920s, early jazz drummers had liberated them and added swing. Interesting. Maybe a whole hour on jazz drumming. We could do that. Grassy Knoll asks, is Britain becoming a police state? It always was. This is the thing. There was, proportionally speaking, for a while, a bit more individual freedom, but Britain's always been a very, very reactionary, deeply anti-democratic and authoritarian place. I mean, it's just most of the time you can't see it. But bear in mind, the government has always had basically unlimited power over us because we don't even have the supposed rights that are afforded to the citizens of the United States, because we're not citizens, we're subjects of the crown. And as subjects of the crown, we are subjects of King Charles, the friend of Jimmy Savile, who and his government are free to dispose of us as they see fit. There is no real rights under the British Constitution. The British Constitution is, of course, unwritten, which means that those in charge, which is basically the bureaucracy on day-to-day matters, and then the ruling class behind them, get to do whatever they like to us, and standing behind the royal prerogative, which is the reason why they keep the monarchy around. It's a reserve tool of reaction, meaning the centrality of the monarchy to the British unwritten constitution is important because basically it enables the British ruling class to make the constitution into anything they want to. So Britain's always been a deeply reactionary place with a state that has a gigantic amount of power over us potentially. They only exercise this, though, against isolated sections of the working class, or in, of course, the colonial countries, the colonized countries. They've done it periodically in this country in times of strikes. What's happening is that because of social media, when they do try to strong arm somebody, it becomes public much quicker. So, for instance, like 40, 50 years ago, if they wanted to strong arm a journalist, they could do it pretty easily, and it wouldn't come out. Get the agreement of his editor, slap a D notice on the whole thing. So if 40, 50 years ago, if they wanted to lean on, say, a Kit Clarenberg or a Richard Medhurst, assuming such men could ever have gotten careers in the old bourgeois press here, then you just call them in for a talk off the record, which is what they've done with these guys now. You call them in, you tell them, we want you to come in and talk to us. By the way, if you don't, we might arrest you. You lean on them, you pressure them, you get them to give up bits of information, they hope anyway, and you intimidate them. This is how they would have dealt with journalists 40, 50 years ago who were writing critical things about the British government. And they would have done it and they'd have got away with it and it wouldn't have come out. Because back then, they had such tight control over the bourgeois press that you could cover up almost anything. And it would only come out years later. So the difference is now, yes, it's more and more reactionary laws have been passed, but they've always had the power to do this. I mean, what's happening now is that they can't get away with it anymore because it immediately goes public. See, what they're aiming to do with these, shall we say, compulsory talks that they bring dissidents in for, they're hoping to intimidate you. And that used to be a lot easier to do when there was no mobile phones, there was no social media. If you were brought in to be lent on by Special Branch or MI5, and you were working for a newspaper or you were working freelance, your editor or whoever had commissioned you wasn't going to run that you'd been lent on by the state. Not really. So the difference is now is that, as I said, they can't cover it up. But again, like, you never underestimate how very, very reactionary, even by bourgeois standards, the British government has always been, and how unfree Britain really is. Like, what they're good at is they're good at putting on a show of toleration and respect for different points of view and that kind of shit. The usual liberal tropes. But there's always been a line, as there is in every bourgeois state. There's a very clear line that journalists didn't ever really cross. Bourgeois journalists didn't ever really cross in Britain. And that line is related to the activities of British imperialism. And it's rare that anybody crossed it. A few did, like Paul Foote, the late Paul Foote did. The late John Pilger did from time to time as well, when he could get something published. But really, it went over the stuff that the likes of Kit Clarenberg covers. Nobody would have touched that 50 years ago. Nobody. Because, it would have brought you an immediate visit from the state forces. So things haven't really changed. What's happened is that the legitimacy of the British systems become more and more compromised, and they get exposed quicker when they do try and lean on somebody. Yeah, Luca, in answer to your question, I mean, any talk of restricting arms to Israel by the British is just PR. Um, instead of that, why don't we? I mean, I think in fairness, Corbyn did ask, like about the he asked Lammy, the foreign secretary, about the spy flights. I think I need to check that detail. But yeah, why are they still running spy planes over Gaza for Israel? What are the Israeli military doing with regard to sending their aircraft to British bases? Is Britain involved in resupplying or re-equipping Israeli aircraft to carry out attacks on Gaza? We have a suspicion that they are, but again, nobody's saying anything about what is the role that the British bases on Cyprus are playing with regard to assisting Israel. If they were serious, they'd be talking about, or they'd be cutting off the assistance that's coming from there. It's quite obviously coming from there. Krasovet says, check out Bulgarian socialist jazz. I will indeed. I will indeed. Tom Jones says, hip hop started out as truly subversive. Now it's utter shite. Yeah, I mean, started out, it got subverted very quickly, and they turned it into what, gangster rap. Ironically enough, a certain Mr. Sean Coombs is on trial now for regard to sex trafficking and various other things. So clearly, his usage to the American ruling class has run out. But yeah, it got turned into utter crap very quickly, which is what capitalism does with culture. Because culture is designed to serve the needs of the bourgeois, subversive culture gets, again, subverted itself by being placed in service of the bourgeoisie. Svetlana says, I nearly bought The Road to Wigan Pier the other day, but thought I'd ask you first, is there anything of value, anything of worth in this book by Orwell? Only in the bad sense. You know what, Svetlana, you've reminded me that a long time ago, in fact, back when this was a podcast-only show, I thought that I would do a show on like Orwell. I think I'm probably going to have to go back to that. So yes, I will. The latter part of The Road to Wigan Pier is a good example of everything that's wrong with the British left. So from an educational point of view, that might be of interest to you. Mr. Trumpy88 says, good evening, comrade. Just in after a pro-Palestine demonstration outside Sadler's Wells. Interesting. Hope it went well, comrade. Is Ben Norton the American Owen Jones? In fairness to Ben Norton, he's not that bad, you know? Is it true that Pol Pot was given was the name given to him by French intellectuals signifying political potential? I don't know, Svetlana, in answer to your question. I'll have to come back to it. Rista Costadino says lots of communists from Cambodia went to Vietnam, Laos to fight. The Khmer Rouge were nationalists who used some kind of left aesthetics. Yeah. Khmer Rouge is something that I only know a little bit about, so I'd need to do more reading on. Tom Joad says, how many Israelis have fled the country? I read at least 500,000. Apparently a whole plethora of startups have bailed out because of this genocide. Yeah, and we heard the other night that they're buying up a lot of property in Greece at the moment. President Jesus says, Douglas McGregor on Judge Napolitano's show compared Hillary Clinton to Lenin in a rant about free speech. That's multipolarism for you. In a nutshell, yes. It means like siding with or promoting reactionaries who like denounce certain aspects of American imperialism whilst reaffirming other aspects of it. Yeah, Risto Kostadinov says, I found a lot of people who say they're left-wing, in inverted commas, or multipolar bros inviting McGregor on, or unmentionable word Scott Ritter. Yes, well, I've long since ceased paying any attention to either of them for various different reasons. T.G. Wilson says, the best jazz is now in Europe and Asia. Check Hiromi Uehara. She's a piano player from Japan. Best singer in the world, in my opinion, is Dimash, Kazakhstan. Check out SOS Live in Russia. New jazz music recommendations coming in live on, or being brought to you from, I should say, the Marx Engels Lenin Institute. Your hot spot for Marxist jazz. I can actually play jazz pieces myself on the trumpet. I may go back to that. Dinner with Franklin says, Hillsborough tragedy took 20 years to uncover. Yeah. I mean, this is the thing. People outside of Britain don't realise how truly repressive the British state has always been. They had to make certain concessions for a while, but it's always been very repressive, very secretive, more than capable of burying you in prison for decades and suffering no consequences as a result. Svetlana, you say you like Django Reinhardt and prefer old blues like Robert Johnson and John Lee Hooker. Well, all points of view welcome here, except for Coldplay fans. We must do a jazz episode. Christopher Rogers, good evening to you out in Hong Kong. Mouse SF says, I was blessed to perform in Moscow in 1999. What a great time and beautiful city. Never been to Moscow. Hope to do so soon. David King says, best rap band was the Disposable Heroes of Hipocrisy. I remember them. Svetlana says, I never tell anybody I'm left wing or that I'm a communist. I say I'm a Marxist-Leninist. Well, I say communist, but again, like I have to explain Marxism-Leninism because communist is a word that's been abused by Trotskyites in this country. Irish Partisan says, didn't Stalin ban jazz back in 1935? I don't know, to be honest. I'd have to look into it. But I think the discussion of jazz tonight reveals that jazz is something which comes from the oppressed of the United States, so isn't something that should be regarded as part of the crap that's served up to us as bourgeois culture. Okay, right. So I'm going to have to knock it on the head for this evening. I'm going to hand you back over to a musical interlude again. Be back tomorrow with the Stalin episode, so please be sure to join me for that one. Same time, same place. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. I'll be back again with you very soon, but until then, I will hand you back over to your musical outro.
maszyna i piec hutniczy strzela płomienie, gdzie się robota wielka zaczyna. Ty jesteś partią natchnieniem. Tyś nauczyła nas pracować i życie dać dla kraju. Prawda, że z partią naszą wrząbać, tę powiem ponad na
Praha, Československé zahraniční vysílání.
Rozwiel czas, a oni nadziejemni, swobody słońce, myśli są wokół. Przed sobą zimne, zasnimy nocemi, nie uśmiechni Panu, ani ziemia dół. Przed sobą zimne, zasnimy nocemi, nie uśmiechni Panu, ani ziemia dół. Będę miru dla głową sekretem, więc człowiek temi, drugim człowieku. Przed sobą zimne, zemi zaswidzenie, te roku na marnie, lenia obiegu. Przed sobą zimne, zemi zaswidzenie, te roku na marnie, lenia obiegu. Kochu serce, swojne swoim miru. Potem oczy, potem okupot, czas mi każdy z nas obrazi milu swe. Tam, gdzie se naccesiła jeden raz, tam se odeskie. Straduje, no ruchije paslepi, do nejde svítem, ręce francuskie. Przed sobą zimne, od nich stepki, na puszczarni widy, bije do plakiem. Przed sobą zimne, od nich stepki, widy do plakiem. Przed stwornie pracy, ponejle si ruce, a pisek, a to jest.
miền biển xa, người đi khắp phương trời. Ở nơi xa đó, người dân đói nghèo, từ đau thương người đi khắp năm châu, lòng tin mặt trời chân lý sáng soi, dõi chiếu sáng dân mình. Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh. Vượt trùng sông, người đi khắp phương trời, luyện tôi ý chí, lòng núi căm hờn. Hồ Chí Minh, người đi khắp năm châu, lòng tin mặt trời chân lý sáng soi, dọi chiếu sáng dân mình. Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh, Hồ Chí Minh,